Hey everyone, this is Ryan Henry for runonce.com. So we're currently going through a hand history of a 109 that I played on 8-day poker, 150k guarantee, uh, probably about 3 weeks ago now. And we're about 404 hands in, so we have just under, I'd say, about 100 hands to go. So should be able to smash it out in this video. And we'll just jump straight into it. So very next hand after the kings, we see chip leader here coming for an open. Only 40 hands actually on this player, so we haven't played a ton. They're obviously going to be wider here than we would see at Chippy V, or at least they should be. Uh, Even if they're considered, Ace-Jack O here is just not going to be good enough to shove this deep, especially just given the ICM. Getting caught here and losing is a pretty big disaster. So I think flatting just is going to be the best option of this hand. Seems a little bit too strong to want to be 3-bet folding, just fold not too much equity. I think in terms of like a 3-bet bluffs, Ace and O makes a lot of sense here. But yeah, so I think flatting here is just going to be the best option. Actually, let's just quickly run this in Hold'em Resource Calculator and we'll jump back to the hand. Okay, so here we have the sim. So this is the range that I thought villain may be opening here from the hijack. Actually, they're probably opening 8-6 suited as well. But I think this is, yeah, somewhat accurate. I mean, maybe they open tight and maybe they open loose. It's difficult to say, but I think this is pretty reasonable, especially with a few shorties as well. You don't want to go too crazy. You want to be more blocker heavy. And so I think we also just have a look at their calling range. So if I shove for 33 or 32 and a half effective, I think it's likely villain is calling this range. Although not impossible, they flick in ace, queen, O, and 8 some of the time. So maybe let's just do that. And so if villains call in that range, and if they're opening as wide as I thought they might be, then this is what we can profitably shove. So it looks like 10s plus ace, queen suited, ace, queen, O. Ace-Jack suited, king, queen suited is pretty much dead break even here. And if villain is, folding, say, 8s and ace, queen, O, which I'm not sure if they are, then you see a few more hands sneak in here. But these hands are obviously, very, very marginal relative to the prize pool. But we can see in both scenarios, Ace-Jack O is just actually losing here and should just be played as a flat. Okay, so after looking at that sim, I think Ace-Jack O just going to be best played as a flat here. If villain was incredibly wide and, over folding, then this hand I could see definitely being fine as a shove. But I think in reality, we just want to be flat in this one. So not a flop I would really want to have any leads on. And we have even less leads when you consider the ICM, where this player can exert a lot of ICM pressure on us, and therefore we want to be leaving even less of our range, just not wanting to blow the pot. Pretty interesting turn here. I certainly do have some straights in my range. So I'm going to have hands like ace-9 suited, 9-10 suited, jack-9 suited, queen-9 suited, king-9 suited. So we definitely have quite a few straights here. The ace of diamonds is certainly a relevant blocker as well, blocking some of villain's nut flushes, and we could perhaps rip, some flushes on a diamond river. We also can get villain to fold a few hands that dominate us, so obviously ace-king, ace-queen, villain will be folding here to a bet, and I think villain even folds some pairs to a larger bet here, so perhaps a hand like king-6 suited, maybe even like king-7 suited, something along the lines, jack-7 suited. So I think villain definitely has, some folds from hands that beat us. Although in saying that, I do think this hand is mixed and we shouldn't always bet on the turn. Looks like we check this time, which is fine. And villain goes for a pretty interesting size here of half pot. I think when villain uses this size, and it's likely they're incorporating some weaker hands here, so perhaps some 7x, perhaps some 6x. And because of that, I just think we should fold our hand here on turn. Very next hand, so we're picking up a few hands here. Cutoff opens. This hand, most just going to be 3-betting to stack off here. And we do cover this player, so perhaps I think we can a bit out of line, trying to exert a bit of ICM pressure. If, say, big blind was, I guess, crazy and very, very aggressive with 3-bet shoves, then I would prefer flatten this hand. Same with small blind if they were squeezing a bunch, then I prefer flatten. But, we don't really have that read on the chip leader here, only 41 hands, so I don't really want to make too many assumptions. And so, yeah, just going to play the standard as a 3-bet call here. And win a pretty big flip here. So king, queen suited, I think is fine to go either way pre-flop. Shoving here is certainly fine being out of position, especially having some pretty good blockers to my range. And if villain thinks that I'm 3-betting light, then shoving this hand is completely reasonable, especially because it would disincentivize me from 3-betting as much in the future if I keep getting 4-bet shoved on. And then the other side of that coin is this hand does play very well post-flop. It is going to dominate quite a few of my 3-bet fold range. So perhaps, King 10-0, King Jack-0, for example. So I think villain could have gone either way with this hand. And they only have 76 hands on me. And I think based on my stats, I look like I've been pretty tight of that sample. So for villain, I think just flatten is probably best just based on the stats that they have on me. So folds to small blind who limps here. Just looking at their stats, they seem to be playing a fairly tight range from small blind. Even if they're considered, I do think we get to raise this some of the time. And looks like we decided to raise this time. Villain ends up calling. And somewhat interesting flop. Definitely not a spot we want to be range betting, especially because I think villain's range here is fairly tight pre-flop. And so I imagine they have, a chunk of their range that connects with the board. But with that being considered, this hand has very, very low equity. I can still target some of villain's range appropriately with a 1 big blind size in here. And we also get to ramp up our c-bet frequency anyway because of the ICM pressure we can exert on villain. And I also think as an exploit, players just don't continue correctly here versus small size and they don't raise enough. And it can be quite difficult for them to find the correct defending range. So with all that considered, I do like betting with this hand almost always. So King Jack O here, we definitely want to be playing either as a flat or a 3-bet. Both options seem very reasonable, and looks like we're flatting this time. Not a flop I want to lead. So villain checks back here, and yeah, I think their range could still be somewhat protected. They're probably checking back some of their weaker queen X, some pocket pairs, ace highs, some hands that they don't really want to be facing a check raise with. So our hand is a pretty good candidate as a bluff here. We block some of villain's slow played stronger queen X, so king queen, queen jack. We also have the jack of diamonds here, which is a really relevant card blocking some of villain's flush draws and also allowing us just to continue barreling on some diamond rivers. In terms of sizing, this seems fine. We could even go a little bit larger, being as deep as we are. And on this river, obviously not ideal having the jack of diamonds, but I still think we have a really good bluff candidate. We still block some of villain's stronger queen X. We unblock the ace high. We unblock, say, sevens, eights, nines. And so I think we should just continue barreling this one. Again, in terms of sizing, this is fine. We could go a little bit larger as well. And looks like villain has king, queen, O. And I think villain played their hand fairly well. They definitely should be checking this on the flop sometimes, especially when we are similar stack depth on the final table. Although betting this hand is perfectly fine too. I think it's just going to be a mix. And yeah, happy with how we both played our hands. So it looks like we take an ace king O 3-way here. So definitely a spot I wouldn't expect leads from either opponents, and a spot which I should just be c-betting especially this hand for a small sizing. Yep, quarter pot looks to be good. And we see the big blind call. So really good turn for the big blind here. And in theory, I would expect some leads here, although in practice, we don't see it as often as we should. This is a hand which we can mix here, although I do prefer betting because I just don't think players are going to be check raise shoving here very light at all. I think when we do get check raise shoved on, we're going to be up against, say, like 2 pair plus, straight draws, flushes. So hands that we just lose to. So yeah, my plan here is to bet small because I think players play pretty honest here, and I would be folding to a shove. And then, depend on some rivers, I would either check or shove myself. Chip leader opens button here, and there is a lot of ICM pressure on us. So my defending range here is actually going to be really tight, just considering the small blind and the cutoff stack sizes. This hand here is one that's just too strong though, so either going to continue as a 3-bet bluff or as a flat, and we flat this time. Obviously no leads on this board, and yeah, one I would expect villain to be stabbing really often. Ace-5-0 with no club though, not going to get creative. This hand just going to have to pure fold. Although having the ace of clubs, this is one which I would be check raising really often on this board versus this sizing, but just going to have to let this one go. So small blind ends up shoving here. Definitely call for chips, but in this situation, I think their range is going to be a bit tighter. Ante's obviously a little bit small. Just going to fold this. And I think, yeah, Jack 10-0 would be much, much closer, and I'd probably just go with that one. So worth showing this hand, even though I'm not in it. We see button shove and big blind call. And looks like big blind doubles up here, and the button is crippled. Perfectly standard from both players. Again, so not in this hand, but worth showing. So cuddle shoves, small blind re-shoves, and yeah, standard from both players. Looks like we're going to be three-way. So open the button here. I am going to be tighter with my opening range. Obviously, antes are really small here, but also this player can put a lot of pressure on me. So yeah, I am going to be very, very tight opening. Pre-flop, or at least reasonably tight. But ace-5-0, just too strong to be folding. Really good board for my range, and one I am just going to be stabbing with range, especially because my pre-flop range is going to be a bit more tight. So small blind limps here, which is somewhat strange. This is a spot which they can raise pre-flop extremely wide, and they should be doing it with most of their range, especially because they can just handcuff me really, really heavily here with the button being so shallow. So not really sure of what to make of this. I suspect it is just quite a weak range for the most part. This is a hand which we can mix between raising and checking back. And it looks like I'm checking back this time. So villain ends up checking here. This is a board which we do interact with fairly well, but we are going to be betting here somewhat polar using a larger sizing. As it is quite coordinated, and we don't really want to be betting our 5x for value / protection here, unless it has some sort of, say, straight draw to go with it, like a 5-7, especially with like a flush draw. This hand here, the 4 of spades is definitely relevant. We have a gut shot, but we also block some of villain's spade draws, and we can get villain to fold out a bunch of hands that dominate our hand here as well. It's not impossible that villain ends up limping a hand like King 10 or King Jack or King Queen, and betting large with this hand, we can obviously generate some folds. So it looks like I bet this time, which is perfectly fine, and sizing is good. So on the turn here, obviously great turn for my hand, and definitely a card I want to be barreling on with this hand specifically. We still have a lot of bluffs here, and top pair is just very, very often going to be good here. So it looks like we'll go for a slight overbet, and I think this is perfectly fine. We still have a lot of really, really strong hands here that want to chuck in a lot of money, And yeah, this hand is certainly one of them. So ace queen o here, definitely not a spot we want to be shoving in range, as this player doesn't have as much ICM pressure on them, as they clearly the shortest stack here. This hand here we can shove pre-flop perfectly fine, especially these offsuit sort of ace high type hands do really well as shoves. Certainly can induce in this spot as well. It looks like we go for an induce this time, which I think is fine. Where if it was a situation where we can shove any two, then I think that's just going to be the best play, just purely shoving. But yeah, when we have a situation where we can't do that, then I really like either, shoving is perfectly fine, but also inducing this hand is going to be good. So ace 3-0, I don't mind just folding pre-flop, given small antes, given that we can get put into a lot of tough spots pre. Although this player here hasn't really been that aggressive in terms of their 3-betting, and they seem to have quite a high VPIP, so I suspect this player is a little more flat heavy, so we do go for the open and get instantly punished. Yeah, so just obviously going to be folding this hand, especially when I don't think this player is that out of line. If I do think they're out of line, something you could do with this hand occasionally is put in a really small 4-bet and obviously deal with like your very nutted range. And then we can just comfortably fold this hand versus shove. Like if we end up making, say, 14 big blinds, we could very happily fold to villain's 5-bet shove. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and show that. We'll just chuck it into Hold'em Resource Calculator. Okay, so I've gone ahead and just run this spot, which I thought would be pretty interesting to have a look at, especially if you have an opponent, say in this situation, who is very heavily 3-bet bluffing pre-flop, where they just have so many bluffs relative to their value. And obviously, we don't want to overdo this as well, but it is something we should have in our arsenal, as it can be very, very tough to play against. So it doesn't really matter what our opening range is or their 3-bet range. We're more concerned about their 5-bet range. So if we do end up, say, 4-betting to 14 big blinds and they end up shoving, I think villain's range is actually going to be quite tight versus the 4-bet. So perhaps we see a sort of a range that looks like this, where they have ace queen o, ace queen suited, maybe pocket tens that are getting in here for, I believe it was 40 big blinds, 45 big blinds pre-flop. I mean, it could even be tighter than this just based on how players are playing the spot, but let's just run with this and see what it spits out. So if this is villain's 5-bet range, it means this is what our 4-bet calling range will be. So we only call aces and kings. So obviously we can very happily fold a hand like ace 3-0. Let's just say if villain was maybe going a bit wider, which honestly I don't think this is happening, but let's just put in a crazy wide range and see how this is going to change our range. So we would only be able to call in, say, queens plus and then ace king suited plus. So definitely can have quite a few 4-bet bluffs here in our range, and we can just very comfortably fold. So you'd only want to use this if your opponent was getting pretty out of line, and having that ace blocker is really, really key here, blocking some of their 5-bet shoves. But I think villain is going to play super, super honest versus this not all in 4-bet. And yeah, perhaps we'd only see a 5-bet shove range like this, maybe like this. It's hard to say, but I think it is going to be really narrow and really honest. Not a hand I'm in, but certainly one that is worth showing. So small blind shoves, big blind calls, and we see small blind double. Definitely standard from both players. So folds mean small blind. Like I said before, this isn't a situation we can shove any two because we can't exert as much ICM pressure on this player as they're clearly the shortest. And because of that, we want to do a bunch of limping and not all in raise. And we definitely have some hands that just want to shove here, but there's definitely some that want to induce. This hand here really does benefit from raising not all in here. We have a suited hand, but also we have a hand which we can get villain to fold out a bunch of hands that dominate us. It looks like we get it through. And obviously we want to mix it in with some sort of stronger hands like that ace queen o that we used before as the inducing range. So button opens here and got to defend this hand. We cover the button as well, so not going to be at risk here, which makes us want to defend a bit wider. No leads from me. And versus a quarter pot, just very easy defend. I would expect villain to actually be range betting here, especially because their pre-flop opening range should be quite a bit tighter, or at least somewhat tight at this stack depth, but also being on the final table. Terrible turn for my exact hand, and yeah, a much better card for villain's range here. And so just going to have to let this one go. So folds me here with Queen 10-0. Not a hand that I really want to be inducing, and not a hand I really want to be limp folding. So I really like throwing this hand into the shoving category. So villain comes in for an open here. Pocket fours, pretty well just going to be flat in here. If I thought villain was opening an insanely wide range and then they'll fold in an insanely wide range, then I'm very happy just to shove fours. But I think it plays really well here in position at the stack depth. So a board I would expect to see villain C bet somewhat often, but definitely not range betting, as this does interact somewhat well with my range. And I do suspect they're probably raising a pretty wide range pre, so because of that, their range being so wide, mine being quite tight, they don't want to be range betting here, but I do suspect we'd see quite a bit of C betting. This hand here, I just want to start working towards showdown if I can. Villain checks here again, no reason to start putting any money in the pot here. We could just have the best hand, and I don't really want to inflate the pot. Villain checks river, and I think we have the best hand somewhat often, but definitely not always. Villain could still have some 6x, a hand like pocket fives as well. And so, and I just don't really see villain calling too wide here. So, I mean, villain could call some ace high, but I think for the most part, we just value own our sides when we start betting. So just trying to work this one in showdown. So clear open here. Definitely going to be a bit tighter. Like I'd fold queen, I know, in the situation with the stack distribution, but definitely raising queen 10-0 and queen jack-0. Very easy fold versus shove. So jack 6-0 here can go either way as a limp or a raise. Raising this time. And villain does a pretty small 3-bet not all in. I think this player is definitely capable of having some bluffs here, but yeah, nothing we can do with this hand, and obviously just have to fold. So chip leader ends up limping here, and I've seen them limp quite a few times in this situation. I don't think they realize they can isolate or shove here as wide as they can, especially just given the stack distribution where this player and myself are pretty close to stack sizes, and so this player can go pretty crazy here. This is one which we can either check back or ISO. I think both are certainly fine at some frequency, and we isolate this time. Really good board from our range, and just a situation I'm going to be range betting. I think villain is somewhat deficient in their ace-x because some will shove pre, some will raise pre, and then some will limp shove it versus an ISO. So I think villain's really deficient here, where I still have a lot of ace-x in my range. So in terms of size, and I actually really like the one big blind bet here. I think players overfold, but they also don't show enough aggression versus sizing, so we just don't see that much check raise in here. So I think villain has a hand very often that is better than mine. Perhaps they have some 4x. They probably have a lot of king high, perhaps some queen high type holdings. This hand is one which we obviously just want to keep betting. We have not so much showdown here. And we also have some really good blockers. So we block some of villain's 3-deuce suited type hands. We block some of their flush draws with the jack of clubs. And we don't interact with any king high, queen high type holdings, which we can still target pretty efficiently. So I really like betting here, and villain ends up calling. Obviously, we just made pretty much the nuts here. I still think villain can call a bunch of hands that we beat. Then we get heroed here sometimes for sure. Villain could still have some ace-x, but I just don't think there's much in the range. But obviously, that's a hand that will be calling a shove. But I don't think it's impossible to get called by a hand like 5-6 of clubs, or maybe even perhaps some 4x if villain doesn't believe me. But we do end up picking up a pretty nice pot. So 10-7 suited, a hand which I'm actually just going to be limping here, pretty much pure. Not a hand I really want to be 3-bet folding or 3-bet calling to a raise, so just makes limping really attractive. And we've definitely seen this player go for a not all in 3-bet as well. They seem to be fairly aggressive too, so I just don't want to give them that opportunity. So this flop here is going to be pretty good for my range. I don't suspect players to raise as often in position. And I think in this situation, villain just is going to be very ace-x deficient, or at least the strongest ace-x. They still check back some. This player here has been actually somewhat aggressive with check raising, and I think that does translate to raising c-bets as well. Only 12% of the time, so not too often, but small sample. I think this hand we can go either way as a bet or a check. Villain ends up calling. Just going to try and work this one as showdown, having bottom pair and a gut shot. Again, on river, I think if we bet here, we mostly just get called by a jack. And so there's just no values to be had here. Just going to try and work the showdown. And I think villain played the hand well. I think pre-flop is certainly a mix of this hand. So pretty strange. I think my tracker actually missed tracking some hands, because we've suddenly gone from this player being chip leader to me being chip leader and then being equal distribution. And there's no hands in between. So I'm not really sure what has happened here. But somehow it looks like we might be missing some hands. Well, we definitely are, because this player had 44 big blinds and now they suddenly have 30, and I have some chips. So not sure what happened there, but we're just going to continue on with the situation. So ace jack O, definitely going to obviously be raising. And just going to be pretty close to range betting here, as most players don't check raise here enough. I mean, this player's done a 2 of 7, but it's more sample, and we can exert the ICM pressure. So you're just going to be betting super often here. So small blind limps, and this is one we can certainly mix. And looks like we check this time. So we have some really low showdown value here. We do have some reasonable blockers with the 4 of hearts and the 3 of clubs, just blocking some of those flush draws that villain can have, and also some of the backdoor flush draws. And I really just don't mind bet folding this hand, just given how low our equity is. We still have some pretty strong hands here as well, mostly jack 9. In terms of size, and I do like this, we do want to be betting somewhat polar here, and villain calls. So on the turn, I actually think we have some showdown. Villain could have ace high that we beat. They can have jack high that we beat. They can have some flush draws, obviously, which we can beat. So I'm just happy to check this one and try and get it to showdown. And spike 2 pair in the river. But villain does go for a slight overbet here. Not a spot which we want to be shoving, as I think if we shove, we're only going to be getting called by stronger hands. And so just going to be playing this one as a call. And villain has ace king. So I think villain played the hand pretty well. They could have bet flop, but I think flop check call is certainly fine too. And then turn check and river overbet is really good from villain. So this player opens off ace and bigs. They have been playing quite a few hands, and this player definitely looks to be a decent rig. And because of that, I think they call in somewhat correctly here when I shove, so they have to be pretty tight. And yeah, I just think this player's opening too much. I think they fold in probably a bit too much, and this hand's just going to be best as a shove. We do get called this time, and villain has King Queen O. Opening button, and looks like we're taking this one heads up. Really good board for my range, and especially when I cover villain the big blind, who also seems to be, pretty wide pre. Just very happy to range bet here. The sizing's fine. I mean, we could even just go one big blind. This turn here is just going to be a big bet from us and double flush draw. A lot of draws here, and we just want to size up. So round pot's fine. Also, slide over is actually fine, and it sets up for pretty good river shove sizing as well. So clear defend here with the King 9-0. Could consider some not all in 3 bets with some of the more raggedy kings like King Deuce, King 3, King 4. No leads for me. And yeah, just a spot I would expect villain to be range betting. So generally on these boards, we want to be playing very aggressively with a lot of check raises. This is one which we could certainly mix, but I also think that population over fold here versus check raise, they should be calling really, really wide, but that's just not the case. And so I really like raising with this hand, and I mean at equilibrium would see a lot of raising here anyway and get it through. So folds to small blind who ends up isolating. 9-8-0 here, just going to be a pure continue as a call. So villain ends up betting really small here, around just under 20% of the pot. So we should be continuing here with a really wide portion of our range. I know that 9-10-0 I'm calling here always with that backdoor straight draw. So this hand is actually very, very close. I would say it's sort of almost indifferent versus sizing, so I don't mind going either way here, and looks like we end up folding. Fold spin the small blind, and pocket 9 certainly just going for the induce here. It looks like villain ends up shoving. It looks like villain shows up with ace 3-0. I think it's a very fine shove, especially at the stack depth blocking a lot of my calling range. And also I am going to have a lot of hands I can still raise fold. This is just not one of them. And going to be taking this heads up. Ace 7-0, certainly fine to shove here, also certainly fine to call. See villain bet for the smaller sizing. This hand here just going to be a very clear continue, and looking just to call this one and bluff in something a bit weaker, heads up. Could consider leading here. Looks like we do this time again. I think this is fine. We can certainly have the best hand here. We could fold out a bunch of equity. I think it's really reasonable. Now that villain calls, I think it's likely they have something, whether it is a straight draw or a pair or a flush draw. I just want to check this hand and try and get it to showdown. It's not impossible if villain just checks back a busted flush draw that would beat, but I think if they had a hand like 10-7 or 10-8 or Queen-8, we would see them bluff here, so not ideal, but just going to try and work this one as showdown if I can. Not a great bluff candidate. And now when villain uses this sizing here, it's not ideal. We block some of their bluffs with the ace of hearts as well as the 7, some of their flush draws and straight draws. And I've only got, a few stats on villain, but from what I can see, they have been pretty passive with betting the river, so I just want to let this one go. So yeah, ace and O, definitely happy to 3-bet call this one. Heads up. Queen 8-0 here, definitely fine as an open. If villain was pretty aggressive, we could just consider a limp here as well. Both options perfectly reasonable. Definitely not a range bet here, heads up from me. I think we can go either way with a bet or a check here. Always bet an ace 8 and king 8. Queen 8 becomes really close as a bet. And yeah, I'd definitely be betting with a queen of diamonds here. Just having a hand which can handle a little more heat in the check raise line. I'm much more comfortable calling a check raise with the queen of diamonds, where not having the queen of diamonds, having just a little bit less equity in the hand is not as appealing. So it looks like we end up checking this time again. I think it's really, really close. So on the turn here, I certainly want to have some pretty large sizings, just given that I do have quite a few 8x, and an 8x is worth a lot here at this point. And obviously we can delay some just no equity type bluffs here. So if we had a hand like queen deuce or say 5-4, we could consider betting. Now, I mean, 5-4 has a gut shot, but still very low equity. Could even just check that again on the turn. Can go either way. And so, yeah, my sizing here, I do like it. I could even go slightly larger, but this is fine. On river, we have trips with a queen kicker, so the kicker is relevant. And trips here is worth a large percentage of the pot, as much as all in. So I think the size we want to use here with this hand specifically is just going to be all in here, which is what we do and get called by 790. In terms of villain's bluff catcher, I think it's completely reasonable. They just need to determine whether or not myself or population are bluffing enough to make this profitable, but they certainly have a reasonable candidate. Obviously having a pair, and having the 9 of diamonds is a pretty good card because I'm not going to be bluffing really many 9 of diamonds on river, and so they don't interact with my bluffs, which are really, really good. I mean, my bluffs are going to be sort of like 5-4 type hands, some 3-4, 3 deuce, some like jack 3, jack deuce, queen deuce type hands, and so villain does a pretty good job at unblocking those. So overall, I think it's a reasonable candidate, but just need to determine whether I'm bluffing enough or not. Cool. So that's the hand history that I wanted to go through. There were a few interesting spots. Hope you've learned something, but if you have questions, just drop them in the comments and I'll get to answer them as soon as I can. This has been Ryan Henry for RunOnce.com.